Hey everyone, it's Dr. Ramani. Welcome back to this YouTube channel on narcissistic relationships and healing from narcissistic relationships. I talk a little bit, and especially in my healing program, I talked a lot about meaning and purpose. But let's talk about some of these stumbling blocks to finding meaning and purpose after a narcissistic relationship. Lots of people talk about all meaning, purpose, and it's great. It's not magic, but the fact is that surviving feels hard enough when you're in one of these relationships or coming out of one of them. So this idea of meaning and purpose-oriented work can really feel like a very heavy lift. Meaning and purpose are about making sense of what is happening to you, what has happened to you, to create a more coherent narrative, to feel more significant in the world. And there are things that you are meant to do, and again, that you matter. So trying to make sense of the confusion of the narcissistic relationship is completely overwhelming because it doesn't make sense. Someone who proclaims to love you is willing to manipulate you, shame you for who you are or how you feel. How are you supposed to make sense of that? You don't. It doesn't make sense. Unfortunately, this is how this personality works and shows up in relationships. Now, finding meaning and purpose when you feel confused the way you do in a narcissistic relationship can feel even more confusing. So then a lot of people give up, like, forget meaning and purpose. I can't do this. Now, after we have been through narcissistic relationships, the mistake is when we try to find the meaning and purpose in the relationship. And we can get caught and lost in this process of trying to make sense of the relationship, finding lessons in the relationship. You might get lost into digging deep into these thoughts of what were you taught in this relationship? What did you learn about yourself? What did they teach you? What did you learn about life? You dig deep, and I understand, I've done the same, and so you can think that it wasn't a waste of all these years in that relationship, that there was some meaning and purpose that can be derived from the relationship. But I'm not sure that that's always the correct approach. I was recently listening to my dear friend and colleague, David Kessler, the grief expert, speaking recently, and he said something that stuck with me. He said, "The meaning is never in the death. It is in us afterwards." Now, obviously, David's work is very focused on death, and he was talking about the loss of death, but his words struck me so hard as I thought about people, any of us, surviving from narcissistic relationships. The meaning is never in the death, he said. To me, that jumped out as the idea that the meaning is not in the relationship, especially when it's an abusive relationship. The meaning is in us afterwards. And that can be a way to do the very important work of meaning making and purpose as we heal from narcissistic relationships. The meaning is in us afterwards. Think about that. Despite all that happened to you, the invalidation, if you were lucky, the conditional love, the manipulation, the gaslighting, the subjugation, the feeling guilty for having a need, a want, a feeling, the being shamed for wanting to follow your own interests and dreams, the betrayal, despite all of that, you still get up every day and do things in the world. Maybe you care for children, maybe you go to work, maybe you're a good friend, maybe you care for others, but you keep on keeping on despite what happened to you. Despite all that happened to you, you remain empathic and compassionate, and I'm guessing very empathic and compassionate, despite for years in significant relationships getting none of that back. Despite all that happened to you, you may still believe in love. Despite all that happened to you, you may explore new interests in your work, in your life, hobbies. Despite all that happened to you, you find beauty and you feel awe and joy when you see or feel something that's inspiring or even just simply beautiful. Despite all of it, you still enjoy talking with people and hearing their stories. So, despite what happened to you, many of you, and it's still happening to you, many of you are finding meaning and purpose. You get up, You live life. You may care for others. You may feel deeply. You may connect to other people. You engage in human activities that matter to you. You feed your dog. All of that is a big deal. And as you become more clear about the relationship, the patterns, radical acceptance, realistic expectations, the grief, the choices, you may or may not stay in the relationship. It may or may not ostensibly end. But because you are now seeing it clearly and interacting with it differently, I think it's fair to almost characterize it as a sort of death. It's not the relationship you thought you were in before, but you do keep living and moving forward. And the you, after you fully understand the narcissistic relationship, whether you're still in it or not, that's the meaning in you afterwards. Meaning and purpose don't mean some big existential jump into the abyss. It means simply that you are more present in your life, getting joy from some of the moments, enjoying you in those yourself in those moments, allowing you to show up as yourself, allowing yourself to be in a life at times without always wondering if the narcissistic person would approve or whether they'd get angry. All of that qualifies as meaning and purpose. But this isn't about you having to engage in what can feel like the inauthentic and uncomfortable exercise of what did I learn? At the end of the day, it's unfortunate that the narcissistic relationship happened to you, and it's not your role or your job to figure out what you got out of it. Well, maybe you did get things out of it, but that's not the core of meaning and purpose. Because when you do that, once again, you're trying to make sense of something that really doesn't make sense, or run the risk of even rationalizing the relationship. The more important work is to focus on you, on the you who was able to keep on keeping on, love children, for example, despite co-parenting with a narcissistic person, or to keep living life and laughing out loud at times, being a good friend despite the chronic narcissistic abuse. That's the meaning and purpose, that you were able to keep going. The meaning and purpose is embedded in that you are learning that you are resilient, strong, persistent, patient, and that these skills and strengths will generalize into other spaces in your life: work, creativity, caregiving, relationships, and perhaps those things you learned about yourself are what will foster your meaning making as you go forward. If you can still live and laugh and even love after one of these relationships, let me tell you this, you have one hell of a deep capacity for making sense and finding purpose. It's so easy to get lost in the current of, let me figure out what I learned from the relationship. Nah. Yeah, you learned something, but it would have been easier to have learned that in a much simpler way, right? This is really about looking at yourself afterwards and reflecting on your capacities, your compassion, your empathy. The things that may have meant that during the relationship, you made lots of rationalizations and excuses. Those best parts of you, that yeah, they did those things, but those best parts of you still remain. The answers, the meaning, the purpose were always in you. And as you heal, healing is about slowly learning to trust them. Thanks again.